Just a few days after the airstrikes, President Trump went online and declared that he had destroyed 100% of Iran's military. On the evening news, it looked like a perfect tactical victory. In the Strait of Hormuz, commercial ship traffic has collapsed from 80 voyages a day to barely 10. Panic exploded when the same president who had just celebrated victory suddenly had to beg China to send warships to open the lane. In reality, the US military did not lose. This was a financial assassination. So what does overwhelming military power really mean if your enemy can lock up the supply chain simply by changing the currency of payment? The US Fifth Fleet is patrolling the narrow Strait of Hormuz, offering escorts to any merchant ship brave enough to pass through. But the answer they get is dead silence on the water. Iran does not need a massive navy to fight head-on. It only needs a few $2,000 drones and a handful of scattered mines. That kind of asymmetric pressure immediately pushed crude oil above $100 a barrel. The US government opened the strategic reserve to contain the damage, but the market completely ignored it. This is not some distant diplomatic puzzle. We have always believed that the strongest firepower would guarantee total security. But the truth is that capitalism has its own brutal logic. American taxpayers are carrying the cost of giant aircraft carriers because they believe those carriers will keep gas prices low. But in reality, your bill at the pump is now being decided by minds on the other side of the planet. The Pentagon can order Marines into motion, but it cannot order Wall Street risk analysts to believe the mission is worth the cost. So what happens when Wall Street decides that the US security umbrella is a losing investment? Every giant cargo ship crossing the ocean is tied to a single piece of paper, a marine insurance contract. To understand how US power is breaking apart in the Strait of Hormuz, we have to go deeper into the machinery of global trade itself. These ships do not move under their own power alone. They float on an enormous river of Western credit and guarantees. For decades, the presence of the US military acted like a hidden insurance subsidy. When aircraft carriers were on patrol, risk was close to zero, and shipping costs stayed at the floor. But once war breaks out, any vessel trying to move through the Persian Gulf has to buy an extra layer of coverage called war risk insurance. According to maritime analysts like Andreas Krieg, Iran only needs to launch an occasional drone strike to send a bloody message to the market. The moment that happens, the risk pricing algorithms in London respond, insurance premiums surge to absurd levels, wiping out the profit margin of the entire voyage. One risk specialist in London once said it bluntly, they do not care where the US aircraft carrier is parked or how many Marines are on deck. They care only about the probability that a cargo vessel could be damaged by a mine drifting below the surface. Once the computer shows a loss, the insurer automatically refuses coverage for the shipment. Iran understood the fatal weakness in that system. It knew it did not need to sink a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier to win. It only had to prove that these waters were no longer perfectly safe, and capitalism would turn around and bite the Americans on its own. The rules are simple. No insurance means no captain will lift anchor no matter how strongly the US Navy promises protection. Shipping corporations would rather leave their vessels waiting in port than risk losing everything without compensation. The Pentagon built a fleet to confront nations, but it never seems to have built a plan for confronting spreadsheets. The US military prepared for a physical war, but it is losing a mathematical one. The greatest military machine in history has been neutralized, not by a naval battle, but by ruthless financial pricing code. And yet, at the very moment America's shipping system is frozen by paperwork, a narrow door opens in the shadows. Who really rules the oceans now? Naval admirals or the mathematicians of the insurance industry? Beneath the turbulence in the Gulf, Iran has not blindly closed the Strait of Hormuz. Instead of building a brick wall, it is operating a semi-permeable membrane, a sharp economic weapon aimed straight at the throat of US power. The blockade contains an invisible green lane. Trading data from Asian markets suggests that Tehran has created a new rulebook. Any cargo ship priced in US dollars is automatically treated as a high-risk target. But if your contract is settled in Yuan, your ship can receive safe passage. and instantly, survival instinct crushed geopolitical alliances. The clearest example came when 20 giant Indian oil and gas tankers slipped quietly through the Strait of Hormuz without a scratch. They did not survive because of the helpless US destroyers circling nearby. Reports from India's financial press revealed that they passed through because of a direct diplomatic arrangement between New Delhi and Tehran, with energy contracts settled in non-dollar currencies. That move exposed a brutal truth. Loyalty to the US-led order is never greater than the need to keep a nation's power grid running. For nearly half a century, the petrodollar system has been America's exclusive privilege. Anyone who wanted to buy oil first had to buy US dollars, creating endless demand that allowed Washington to print money without immediate hyperinflation. Now, with nothing more than a 34-mile geographic choke point, Iran has forced Asian countries to learn how to use an alternative payment system. But here we need to step back and stay grounded. Does this mean the yuan will instantly replace the US dollar and rule the world tomorrow morning? The honest answer is no. China is not the flawless savior of a new financial order. Unlike the flexibility of the US dollar, the yuan is still tightly controlled by Beijing. The People's Bank of China does not allow its currency to flow freely in and out of the global system. More importantly, China's financial infrastructure and the size of its domestic market are nowhere near deep enough to absorb 100% of the world's energy flows overnight. A full transition is still an unrealistic fantasy for now. But that is not the point. China and Iran do not need to replace the American system all at once. They do not need to drain the ocean. They only need to crack the dam. The passage of those 20 Indian ships through Hormuz shattered a huge psychological barrier. It proved that the world has an escape hatch that does not charge a toll in US dollars. And once countries have downloaded the yuan payment app, so to speak, to save their supply chains, the monopoly habit of the petrodollar is broken forever. If the world learns that it can buy oil without dollars even once, will it ever fully return to the old system? Iran's extraordinary resilience against the destructive force of US air power did not come from a miracle. It came from asymmetric backing by two giants standing quietly in the dark, Russia and China. While Western analysts count the number of US missiles hitting Iranian targets, US military intelligence is worried about the things that do not explode. Reports indicate that Russia is providing sophisticated satellite targeting support, helping Iran lock onto the movement of the US fleet with extreme accuracy. Even more unsettling, China's intelligence vessel Liao Wangwan is sitting calmly in the waters near Hormuz. It functions like a floating supercomputer, constantly collecting radio signatures and radar reflections from the US combat network, then transmitting that data back to the mainland without technically violating international law in a way that would justify American gunfire. Beijing is teaching Washington a classic lesson in parasitic strategy. Why spend tens of billions of dollars playing maritime policeman and protecting the route when you can sit at home, ship a few cheap components to Iran, and force all of Asia to voluntarily bring yuan to your doorstep? China now holds strategic oil reserves of up to 1 billion barrels. It can absorb disruption for months, while the US watches its own economy bleed day by day through rising prices. With the pieces now visible on the board, we can sketch the future of the global supply chain. In the most likely scenario, the Strait of Hormuz becomes a new normal. Western ship traffic stays permanently lower, while energy contracts settled in yuan become the standard way for Asia to move through the danger zone. In the darker scenario, American desperation could lead to airstrikes that destroy the entire oil loading infrastructure of the Middle East so that no one can use it if America cannot, triggering a global recession even worse than the shock of 1973. But there is also a positive reversal scenario. The irrationally high cost of marine insurance could become the strongest catalyst in history for Europe to wake up. Countries like Norway could accelerate investment in renewable energy and independent pipeline networks, speeding up the break from fossil fuels decades earlier than expected. Every path from here depends on two core variables: how long London's war risk insurance rates stay brutally high, and whether China's strategic reserves are patient enough to wait for the US to weaken first. America spent trillions to act as the world's policeman, but now the bill is coming due. And if the cost of maintaining empire becomes greater than the benefit it produces, what happens to the citizens paying for it? That brings us back to an even harsher truth. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a foreign policy headline on the 7 o'clock news. It is a knife pointed directly at the financial future of every American citizen. For decades, Washington pursued an extraordinarily expensive strategy of force, using trillions in tax dollars to maintain giant fleets, impose order, and guard the world's sea lanes. But while the US spent immense sums to provide security, China used financial leverage to buy influence. Beijing did not need to fire a single shot. It only had to offer stable Yuan-based contracts and collect de facto control over energy flows. The terrifying gap between the cost of American gunboat power and the efficiency of Asian negotiated contracts is now being exposed with brutal clarity. And that is why every American should care. The petrodollar is not just some dry academic concept. It is, in many ways, America's biggest and most important export. Because the whole world has been forced to use dollars to buy oil, the Federal Reserve has been able to print money to finance massive deficits without triggering immediate hyperinflation. Economists call that an exorbitant privilege. But when the dollar system gets bypassed at a choke point as critical as Hormuz, that invisible privilege begins to evaporate. Inflation can no longer be exported so easily. The shock will hit the prices of basic goods on supermarket shelves across the United States. It will quietly erode the value of retirement funds for millions of workers, the same workers whose taxes support a military that no longer seems capable of protecting their prosperity. How does America explain to its people that its giant aircraft carriers cannot lower the price of a loaf of bread? Empires do not collapse when their armies are defeated. They collapse when markets discover a detour that does not charge in the empire's currency. This illusion of military power will not be judged at the Pentagon. It will be judged by the cold probability tables of the insurance industry. So are we witnessing the rise of a new order, or just the slow bankruptcy of an old illusion? And if one day the paper money in your wallet can no longer buy oil on the other side of the world, then what is the real power of the superpower you depend on?